So welcome everybody. This is an inter-intellect fireside chat. We will be talking with Dr. Anton Howes about his new book called Arts and Minds, How the Royal Society of Arts Changed a Nation. It's kind of a pet book of mine right now. I really, really loved it. So I was super pleased that Anton, you chose to spend your Saturday evening with us. And we will be talking a little bit about innovation. Do you want to just introduce yourself and say hi to the inter-intellects a little bit? Thank you.
So hi everyone. So as Anna said, I'm Anton Howes. I am a historian of invention, of innovation. And for the past few years, I was official historian for the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufacturers and Commerce. Very long-winded title for a very special organization, and hopefully something that we'll be talking a bit about today, the subject of my book. So my specialty is really the Industrial Revolution and its causes in Britain. And that's how I got onto the RSA, as it's now known. So a 266-year-old organization founded by a few inventors in the 1750s in a coffee house, basically, decided to declare themselves this organization. And then for the next few hundred years, the kinds of groups and people who got involved in that organization, changing Britain and as much as possible the world, for what they felt was the better. So one way to think of it as a kind of national improvement agency, subscription funded, voluntary, kind of semi-official national improvement agency. And when I say improvement, I mean in anything and everything. So that's a bit about me. Otherwise, I was a lecturer in economic history at King's College London. That's where I did my PhD. I was briefly a postdoc at Brown. Blah blah blah. The main thing, I guess, is that I've got this book out and would like to talk about it.
Interestingly, your book kind of kept both the short and the long subtitle tradition of the RSA, right? Because the RSA works a little bit like a famous aristocrat who's just colloquially called as William, but his actual name is like 2 pages long. So I really, really enjoyed that. And actually, if I remember correctly, you do link kind of to in your footnotes to the origins of the word improvement itself. And it seems to be a heavy word in the English language with its own history. Is that important for us to know?
I think it's quite interesting. I don't know how important it is. Definitely interesting, though. I mean, improvement originally just meant raising the rents in a way. To improve something was to get some more money out of it, specifically for land in the 16th century. So that could mean coming up with an improvement, as we'd now think of it, a kind of invention, innovation that would increase productivity so that you could then raise the rents. Or in the 16th century, it just meant raising the rents and seeing what happened. So this idea of it becoming about invention only really starts to take shape in I would say the very late 16th, early 17th century as a word. But there is something interesting about it, I guess, also, in that we often talk about innovation, talk about invention, these kind of things that must be pulled from the thin air, and they kind of take being as though you kind of pull it out of the genius's mind and they kind of take shape. And I think improvement is interesting because as a concept, as a word, because it's much more marginal, it's incremental. It's about tweaking things, optimizing things, taking things as they are and making them a little bit better, rather than kind of doing it from a zero base type, tear everything down, rebuild things from scratch kind of way. I mean, it can be included under improvement, but really it tends to mean there's something a bit more marginal. I think that actually kind of characterizes the RSA as well. It's an improving institution. Very rarely is it trying to tear things down and start from scratch. It's more about filling in the gaps of what's already there. What's not already being done, and trying to find a way to create something where something isn't already being done, reform-wise, when it comes to institutions and so on.
One of the things I enjoyed most about the book was how many bells it was ringing in my head about like recent debates around science versus technology, theory versus applied theory, and just generally this idea of the physicist sitting in under the tree thinking big about the universe, or about metaphysics, versus the kind of hands-on craftsman inventing something that will be useful in real life. But it actually came from, so these two branches come from the same root, right? And people actually expected at first for theoretical physics or generally like scientific theory to have immediate effects in real life. And it took a couple of hundreds of years for people to realize that major theoretical advances won't very quickly translate into everyday appliances. And then the kind of branching gradually took place. Do you think it's something that is about to happen in our current life, or has this already happened in where we are about the current state of technology?
Yeah, that's interesting. So I think it kind of, so I guess you've got these utopian dreams in the 17th century. A lot of people have read Francis Bacon, and they've read his works all about this conquest of nature. We can infinitely improve things to increase living standards and do whatever it is that we want. We can impose our mark on the world through invention, through science, and through the development of useful knowledge. And so they found the Royal Society in the 1660s to partly as a reflection of that. You've got a few people who are especially excited by these ideas. And if you read some of the early Royal Society literature, it's very much a kind of Baconian thing. Then they talk about my Lord Verulam, which was Lord Bacon, or about Francis Bacon. They kind of say, oh, he's doing all these things and we must tear down all existing knowledge and rebuild things from the foundations up, question everything. Alchemy maybe works, astrology maybe works, but we've got to test it. We can't just receive these things from the authorities. And so when they start the Royal Society, they kind of assumed that if they test all this knowledge and they break things down and they rebuild it all and they categorize and classify, that eventually, that pretty automatically almost, you kind of have, I guess, a sort of trickle-down effect to the manual arts, to manufactures, to technology and design, as we would call it. And that doesn't really seem to happen. So you do get a few initiatives in the early Royal Society to do that sort of thing. But what tends to happen is that the scientists think, actually they're going to get much more famous from getting a scientific law named after them, Boyle, Hooke, Newton, etc., than they are for coming up with some invention that might get superseded pretty quickly when the next invention that improves upon it gets discovered, or a competing invention gets discovered. So the Society of Arts is one of a few initiatives, and ultimately, I guess, the successful, long-lasting one in the course of the 18th century to come up with an institution that fills that gap. And it's interesting that you say, you asked me about the modern day. I guess it's kind of gone back and forth. In the 18th century, you get this really big focus on applied knowledge. The Society of Arts originally is really a bunch of, some of them fellows of the Royal Society, deciding that the Royal Society isn't doing enough, and to have an institution that focuses solely on applied knowledge rather than on the science or the natural philosophy, as they would have called it at the time. And I think those are the sorts of institutions that you definitely see being created and built up over the course of the late 18th and perhaps the early 19th century. And then things swing back again. So nowadays, you definitely get a lot of people kind of with this idea that let's just do lots of abstract science and things will happen. And I do wonder if, since the 1980s in particular, with the decline of the Industrial Research Laboratory, a lot of other institutions of the kinds that used to do that application type stuff, we've built up all this scientific endeavor, and we haven't focused quite so much on how it is that we're actually going to take it from science to application. It definitely happens all the time, and there's all sorts of ways in which it progresses. But I think, like in the 18th century, there's this, in the 1750s, they're in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, and they're still creating an institution to accelerate things further. I don't see any reason why, even today, with all of the progress that we see in technology, that you couldn't also see the same kind of, I guess, anxiety that we're not doing enough.
It seems like in the past, maybe 110, 120 years, this dilemma mostly manifested on the level of individual career choice. From, you have these these jokes around the young years of the greatest physicists of the early 20th century who were advised not to go into physics because everything has already been invented, or contemporary AI researchers arriving from academia to work on phone application improvements. And if you actually interview individual scientists or technologists, that dilemma will be embedded at some point in their decision making. And I'm so one of the things that really struck me around the book was that I was really wondering, how did you define the scope of this book? You have this giant mass of information, I would imagine available at like deeper or less serious research around the history of this wonderful institution. And we know from your other work that you're very active in discussing the current state of science, and you write a lot about current affairs at Flink or your Substack, or more recently in the new magazine Works in Progress. So I'm curious, first of all, what was this how the book actually came to be published? Was that structure the originally intended structure, or were there greater changes as you were working on it? And how much the relevance of certain questions to our current life influenced your decision making around it?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, it came out of a chapter in my PhD thesis, which I'm now returning to, which is on inventors of the Industrial Revolution. And it was specifically about prize-giving inventions. So for the first 100 years, the Society of Arts was essentially a premium society. There was a fund that people put together the fund, and then they used that fund, directly, democratically debating and deciding what it is they do with it, to pay inventors for their secrets, to give awards and medals and so on. So I guess originally it's just a kind of historical interest, and then being involved with the society. So they approached me about writing this history even though there's no anniversary coming up. I have no idea why now. It just sort of was a whim of some sort that they decided it would be a good idea. So yeah, having to plan the book in that respect was, okay, here's a society. I don't really know that much about it. I know some aspects of it. And then it was about pulling out, I think, a lot of detail, or at least, first of all, trying to get the broad brush strokes of what was going on, which actually was probably the hardest bit, because the society was involved in so many things. I mean, if you look at there's a reason I chose this cover, which shows, there's a Society of Arts in the middle representing it. And then there's these branches, everything coming off it, all these kind of bizarre little projects and other things. It's almost like it keeps growing and growing and growing. And we've got forestry, workmanship prizes, and chemistry, etc., etc. It just gets involved with so many things that every time I pulled on one thread, I kind of discovered that you feel like you'll keep pulling on the threads, and then you'll come to the end, and here's the answer, or here's the thing I should write about, or here's how I should structure this chapter. And instead, I just find more threads coming off that original one that I then had to tug on and keep pulling on, in a kind of never-ending cycle. So a lot of it, I think, was, the historian's craft, I guess this taught me more than anything else, is often about what to leave out than it is what to include. And when you do include it, how it is that you're going to structure it. So that there's at least the semblance of a narrative. So I think the chapter that was shared, chapter 6, right? That was an interesting one to write in particular, because that's actually one of the few cases, I think, where, the story kind of made a bit of sense. You've got this powerful personality, Henry Cole. He's got certain projects. He makes the society all about what he wants to do. In other periods of the society's history, though, you've just got this kind of hundreds of different voices coming at it, trying to bend it to their will, to try and get it to do the sorts of projects that they wanted it to do. And so you get kind of overlapping histories in a sense, and sometimes you have to tease that out and try to portray that separately. And sometimes I guess you kind of just have to skirt over it and stick a little footnote in and hope another historian picks it up in the next 50 years. I've no doubt that maybe I'm young enough that 2054, when it is the third anniversary, the tricentenary of the society, I might be the one to write the new edition. But I imagine there will
I
be
love
others.
these idiosyncrasies in the book. It's so, to me, you know, as a startup founder building the inter-intellect, you know, it's always a little bit of a chaos. They're always different people and they want different things. And you're kind of like in between trying to create some kind of, you know, coherent narrative, right? And what I love about books like this is that you understand that even at the greatest level, that in retrospect would look, oh, it's like perfect. It made sense immediately. Like, no, it was chaos. I love your part about this guy who is one of the only people managing to bring together some affection in the RSA, because he always gets people drunk and like he just brings out the wine, and then the euphemisms in the menus where it's like heated debate until late night or something, like disagreement, and you can imagine that people probably like tore down the house. And all these individual geniuses who kind of misbehave, you know, Barry the painter who locks everybody out of the room after taking a lot of money and just like paints whatever he wants. And all these kind of almost rock star stories that you would expect to read in the unauthorized biography of some 1960s guitarist from Tor. And it just kind of happened in the middle of London, using up subscribers' money.
Yeah, but you have to kind of be, I mean, that's, and you know, sometimes I come across these little stories, and those are some of my favorite ones. You're drowning them in bumpers of wine, I think is the quotation for the Francis Hayman, the artist who tries to get the other artists together, eventually to form the Royal Academy, which is a sort of splinter group of a splinter group of the Society of Arts. But yeah, it turns out getting them drunk is the only way to get these personalities to actually get anything done when it comes to working together. But yeah, I mean,
challenge on Zoom, you have to inspire people to kind of remotely get drunk with you, but you can't directly influence. You can't just like bring out some kind of. Although I participated at one conference recently where they actually mailed drinks from California to have during the conference. Idea. And I was like, how is this going to survive until the conference? It's like days away. You can't just like dump this into my mailbox in Europe. It's not how it works.
That's a fun idea. It's a bit expensive, but it's a fun idea. But yeah, I mean, sometimes I pick up these stories and I think, how am I going to fit this into the narrative? I like was looking for excuses sometimes to like shoehorn them in, and occasionally they'll be in, you know, parentheses at the end of a paragraph. It's like, here's a fun little anecdote to tell and kind of sneak in there. I tried to always leave them out the footnotes. Partly because they're all the endnotes, they're at the back of the book and not many people will necessarily go and look. To be honest, the endnotes are really there for the historians, you know, just in case they have a follow-up question or they kind of want to check my sources and find these other bits. Because sometimes that was the other thing, is that the Society of Arts impacted so many different parts of different fields of history, of what you could now go and study as a historian, that I wanted to leave a kind of trail and say, here's what, you know, if you're interested in here's an example. If you're interested in the origins of a universal musical pitch, right, which is something the Society of Arts was involved with, this is where you should go and look, and here's how the society was involved. So there's certain topics I had to name check.
It's so
and just
generous.
stick in there.
It's really generous. It can kind of like, the book can generate its own circuit of research.
Well, I think, I mean, when writing it, I was thinking, you know, there'll be the readers who will get it this year and next year, and then, you know, they'll kind of decline, and hopefully maybe new fellows of the society might pick up the book and so on. But then I was thinking, you know, the next one will be in 2054. So in the meantime, this has to be the history. And that's a lot of pressure in some ways. And you kind of have to make sure that not only are you getting things right, obviously, that's the kind of the bare minimum really, but that you're actually putting in everything that's relevant. You're putting in the key bits of the narrative so that historians can pick up on it. Because one thing, reading the older histories, the one from 1954, there's an older one from, I think, 1913. There's a kind of middle one in between that was just a kind of smaller version of the first one. And these are they're useful books, but they're reference books in some ways. They're written by former secretaries of the society, basically the equivalent of the CEO today, who'd been in the post for decades at the time in both cases. They didn't write about their present very much, or even the recent past that they'd affected. And even then, they kind of reflect a lot of biases of the time. And I think that's one of the things I tried to bring to it, was as, I guess, a professional historian rather than someone who's a former CEO of an organization trying to write up all of its glorious past, to first of all do the warts and all aspect, as you said, the kind of rock star stories and broken windows and so on, literally broken windows actually from the exhibition of the artists, which is what I was asked to do, but also to make sure that I'm coming at it with a critical eye and actually working out what is actually relevant, and not just kind of repeating a lot of the PR, not just from today, but from the 19th and 18th centuries. And actually that made writing about today, the very final chapter, was probably the most difficult to write, because picking and choosing what to even mention, what is even a good part of the narrative, what's going to be interesting. There's a lot of committee work and committees and, random like decisions and conferences. And maybe one year they decided to focus on this thing and then they forgot about it. When you've got 266 years to play with, and more projects per year than those 266 years, you really have to focus on what you think is going to be not only interesting, but going to kind of stand the test of time from a historical point of view, I guess.
Actually, that was going to be my follow-up question to this, but you kind of answered it. But still, I'm wondering, why hasn't this book been written yet? I mean, or before yours? Like, why didn't this book exist earlier? A popular, engaging, entertaining, but historically very, deeply researched and structured narrative of the RSA.
That's a good question. It might partly be to do with, in some ways it's probably partly to do with the RSA's own struggle. Given it's a national improvement agency, effectively, that means that it constantly has to reinvent itself and work out what the hell it even is. In the couple of years that I was, now I've still got the title historian in residence, blah, blah, blah. But I was actually in the building for 2 years, or a year and a half really, writing the book. And now that it's out, I'm kind of on hand for them to consult and so on. But have we just lost Anna?
I think we might have.
Oh, there you are. Do you just drop then?
Sorry, I just need a tissue. So.
Sorry. you just suddenly disappeared from my screen.
Myself for a second. Sorry.
No problem. What was I saying?
Why hadn't the book been written before now in your role there?
Yeah, I think it's part of their self-introspection that they're trying to work out what it is that they should do. And to work out what they should do, it's a good idea to look at what they've done. I suspect that's part of why it was commissioned. In terms of why a random historian just hasn't written about it, I guess it's just because it's a very bizarre organization that historians were often using its archives for various different reasons. Maybe they saw that there are a few older histories and they thought it's not up to much, or it's not doing anything particularly interesting. Why would I want to write a specific history about this organization? Institutional histories, I guess, are actually not that common in some ways. And when they're written about something, I guess there's something that's been discovered in some ways. So maybe it was just kind of hiding in plain sight for a lot of people.
Maybe at the RSA it's too much of a given for British people. Like, you guys are just really used to it. So maybe if you hadn't come along, it would have been a foreigner or an immigrant finding it interesting to write about the RSA. I think some institutions, even when they're, Genesis or early history, maybe, incredibly intriguing and full of totally crazy people, the locals can just get used to it as one of the kind of default institutions in the nation.
Possibly. It's just another of those things. Sorry, I see Julie has been putting her hand up.
I'm not sure of the etiquette. Is it okay to ask a question?
Absolutely, please, Julie, go.
Okay. I was really intrigued by something you said just a few paragraphs ago about people's unexamined biases in the past. And I am guessing you thought about their personal biases, but also the biases of the time and the culture and the framework. And I'm wondering if you thought about what your biases might be, or about our current, 2020 biases, to try to foresee those in yourself, but more so in the times, and to try to be curious about that. I would be really interested to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so that's why that final chapter was so difficult, I think, is because the closer you get to the present, the more you're like, well, I've been in the building and I've spoken to all the people and I know what they're doing right now, but what's actually interesting? And actually a really good way to look at this is if you go to the Wikipedia page, you'll notice that it's pretty obvious that certain big parts of it were written by a member of staff in circa 2004, because it mentions very little of the history and it mentions various pretty random initiatives that happened around 2004, 2005, which today people look at it like, who cares? This is just you invited so-and-so to speak at this event. And, and what's the context there? What's the relevance of it? In some ways, I kind of, maybe I sidestepped it a bit, in that I started to see the history of the society in terms of, do you know what? I think my bias in many ways was, in a way, almost kind of crotchety conservative in some ways, because I'd spent so long looking at the 18th and 19th centuries and going, wow, what a great initiative this was. This one failed, but actually, at least the ideas behind it were pretty cool and bold, and they were really doing something. And, something like the Great Exhibition of 1851, that's a big deal. They teach that in primary schools today. These are big events, and some of the most fun to write about, because there's so much thought and philosophy that kind of the different people who are trying to put it together, even though they were competing with one another in many ways. Like it really comes together nicely. And I often struggled with a lot of the 20th century stuff in general, actually, to try and pick out what was actually driving people. Even occasionally, I did some interviews for this, for some of the more recent history. And occasionally, I'd ask, why did you do this? As the historian, I want to create the narrative. I need to know why. And sometimes it just felt like it, because it was the kind of almost a lack of maybe in hindsight it'll become clearer in some ways, and people, and it's the historian's job to work out that it's their societal context that's a kind of driver in some ways, but that made things hard in some ways. So I think I kind of, maybe it's possible that the final chapters, maybe a little dismissive in some ways of some of the projects that went on or have been going on more recently. But I think I guess that was the bias that I became aware of, and then had to trying hard not to let that shine through, and to just say, look, here are some things that happened, and here's what motivated, and here's how it fits into the narrative. But also part of it's also, I think, because of the structure of the society. So I have a chapter, rather cheekily, quoting Jenny Marx, Karl Marx's daughter, called The Society of Snobs, which is, I chose this quotation as a chapter title because I think it quite well encapsulates one of the problems with the society in the late 19th, early 20th century, where it starts to rest on its laurels a bit. It gets the royal name, it starts calling its members fellows, and in many ways becomes disconnected with some of the sorts of institutional things that meant that it had discipline as an organization. Mm-hmm. It's a bit like, the Society of Arts in some ways is like a perpetual startup, right? It has to keep reinventing itself, keep pivoting, keep finding a new niche to fill. But you can't be a perpetual startup if you are cozy and you are comfortable and you just have members anyway, and you kind of seem old and fancy. And I think, a lot of those bits that I was writing there were about, I think, the things that went wrong happening right now as being, it's actually regaining its potential again. Now, that's my opinion, right? This is,
I think the book will.
This is my bias, right? This is a narrative I've imposed on the history. I mean, I've argued it in the book, and you can agree, disagree with my take on things. I'm sure some people who are involved in some of the 20th century stuff will say, what is he talking about? I did this, this, and this. Or, I criticized the regional committees, for example, because they seem to have become a kind of a break on the sorts of things that some of the society leadership were doing. But maybe the leadership were wrong, and actually some of the stuff that these committees were doing was better. So yeah, there's definitely bias, right? This is it's an interesting question, because ultimately, I guess I just have to be honest and say I'm biased too, but these are the biases.
Do you expect some people at the RSA to be woken up reading your book from a type of coziness that might currently characterize the institution?
I think, to the leadership's credit, first of all, they commissioned the book. Secondly, they said warts and all. And then when I sent them the manuscript, a few things that I expected to get a bit of pushback from, I heard nothing. So they were just like, okay, these are the warts we have. We need to get on and deal with this. I don't think I painted the leadership, the current leadership. I discussed Matthew Taylor, who's the current CEO. There's a few pages there, at least, for him, which sounds like it's not very generous, but it actually is, considering some of the secretaries I don't mention at all in the book, because there's been loads of them. It'd be tiresome to just list all their names.
And maybe some people were just glad they got a mention.
I imagine so, yeah. Well, I mean, they're dead now, but there's a lot of them. But I imagine they would, looking back, being like, "Oh, at least I got an in there."
Sounds like they should hire you to write up their wiki page and do a good job of it, because we all depend on wiki a lot. And
yeah, I mean, that's a hard one as well. I feel like I want someone to take the book and go through it and do it, not me, in a way. I think I'm maybe too close to it. In the same way that it is now a new secondary source for people to use in writing it. So I hope they will, because if you look at it now, it really doesn't tell you what the organization is or does. And that's part of the RSA's own problem, and has been for decades, centuries perhaps, is it's very difficult to define. In a way, this book is, in 500 pages or less, what is the Royal Society of Arts? This is the answer,
I really like the parts. Sorry?
Oh, another question. How has writing this book changed you? How is it, what have you learned? Has it made you more creative? How has it changed you?
That's a really interesting question. It definitely revealed certain things that I didn't realize I could do. So so here's a little secret. I know this has been recorded, but so I guess it's not that secret now, but I wrote the majority of this book in the final month before the deadline. And I didn't realize I could write that many words in that space of time. And I mean from blank page to peer reviewed. So tens of thousands.
Wow.
Like, I think my record was 10,000 in a day. And it was almost like it kind of, like the kind of asymptotic curve. As I got close to the deadline, my productivity went higher and higher and higher. So, it was like I spent the month before that month, taking a month to write 10,000 words, and it was 3 weeks, then 2 weeks to write 10,000, then a week, and then just a day or something. Suddenly a lot of it just kind of locked into place, but also I realized that I could do a lot of kind of, I guess you'd call it, writing-led research, rather than just going and reading everything and then hoping that everything kind of worked, and then going and writing everything once I felt comfortable, which is what I've been doing for the first. Actually just kind of writing, and then if I needed to fill in the gaps, going and on the spot pretty much looking it up and working out what was missing. Now, having said that, it's not like I don't think I could do that without having spent that year and a bit beforehand kind of stewing in ideas and context in a way. I think you just have to spend a certain amount of time with material until you just know how it works. Just spending time in the archive. often, a great thing actually was having people visit the archive. Now, I'm not the archivist. There is an archivist who kind of deals with those people, provides them support and so on. But I'd hang around, and being a chatty person, I would start like chatting about their projects and finding out some more, and then in the process actually almost kind of writing the book in terms of how I was talking about the organization, saying these are the books you need to look at for these minutes, and this is the structure and so on, and kind of getting a feel for it in that kind of way. So yeah, I think writing-led research was something. Now this is kind of ironic because I'm trying to finish my second book. I know I can do this, but I'm still spending time just reading things instead of actually just damn writing the things. So it's kind of like,
maybe that's your style. Maybe you're a sprinter, and then you
maybe.
just
Long distance.
Deadlines are good motivators.
Yeah, it may have been the deadline actually. Now the funniest thing about the deadline was that I missed it by about a week. Which is when I realized that my editor didn't actually mind that much at all. So it was kind of, I was taking it so seriously, getting quite embarrassed that I'd missed it. And actually, I finished it, it's come out May 2020, and I finished it in December 2018. So it's a big gap, partly peer review, but also I tried to get it done so quickly so that it would come out in the autumn of 2019, but then, peer review delays and that kind of stuff delayed things. And so I think that's my main lesson. I see we've got a few questions in the chat. Do you want to?
guys, if you can also raise your hand in Zoom. So if you go or physically as well, or just put in participants, you click on raise hand. I would, if you can, just read up your own question from the chat. Let's do a little bit of Q&A, and then I will take back the mic, and then we do a little bit of Q&A again, and this kind of seesaw thing.
We've done the RSA thing and gone off on a tangent. And
oh yeah, I love
it's ended up just going down.
Thank you so much for the wonderful question. So Troy, is that you who would like to go? If you're speaking, please put on your video.
Right, I'm sorry. I will. I'll not. My webcam is on the fritz, and I have been unable to get another one because there is a apparently international shortage of them right now. Because the demand, of course.
Audio. We will take your question audio if Anton is okay.
Okay, just a quick side note, and to anyone reading this. I've been playing with a new app called Roam, which is getting some attention in various corners of the internet. And this sort of research-led writing or writing-led research, however you want to talk about it, like sort of assembling notes as you go. This program is interesting because it seems to support that in a way that is very hard to describe, in which I had not seen before. And I've been writing pretty seriously for about 20 years. So it, might be worth looking at anyway. Some interesting thoughts on assembling a tissue of research by notes and observations and so on, linking it together.
I use Scrivener. That's what I used for that one.
Scrivener is very similar, and that's an excellent program. The thing about Roam that I'm finding interesting is the ability to link topics together and make a sort of second brain, really. Nodes of information that can be linked, in some cases automatically, to each other that you can sort of wander through, almost like a Ficino-style memory palace.
Very interesting.
So, just a thought.
Cool, thanks.
Anyone else? Any notes to Anton?
My question, in fact, was the chapter you shared. It was pretty fascinating reading about the Sedition Act being used and the challenges that was there in the history early on. And you mentioned some of the past history books of the RSA were written by the secretaries of the time with sort of their views. As a historian, where did you find evidence of any revisionist history, and did you struggle with that as well? Because in many cases, history is written by the victor. So perhaps the strong personalities that won over the coal, perhaps, right? Did they have a way of massaging the truth of what led to the outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, Cole definitely did. He wrote a very long autobiography, but actually, in many ways, the autobiography is quite honest because it actually revealed some of the cheeky things that he did. So in some ways, it was like, oh, this kind of dastardly plan that he had. Now I can actually see what he did, because I guess he reached a stage in his life where he just thought, might as well just spill the beans on some of these things. But yeah, you've got to be careful about things like credit and where credit gets put. Things like the Great Exhibition in particular, there was definitely some revisionist history I came across. And interestingly, it's the sort of stuff that, because it happened at the time, a lot of it was taken very seriously by historians. And so you've seen all of the myths that they created, often within just a few years of the event, or even kind of as the event was being organized, that then just kind of got put into it. It's not really major stuff, but things like, for example, I forget what's actually in the chapter that I shared exactly, because it has Cole, it has the Society of Arts, right?
So yeah, it's in the 7th chapter. I think it's the following chapter that actually details.
Oh, 7th, sorry.
Budgetary
yeah, okay,
things.
yeah.
I love the Cole stories, and when he accidentally runs into that guy in the street and gets the loan he basically promises to be the guarantor for the exhibition. I don't think that was an accident.
Yeah, well, it probably wasn't, knowing Cole. He probably knew. Yeah, so in that particular chapter, so things like the anti-corn law bazaar, which I think I mentioned that one, I've not seen that put into the context of the Great Exhibition before, for example. And so, I think when you say revisionist history or kind of revisionism, it's rarely, I think, as straightforward, this thing didn't happen that way. It's more just, maybe there's a bit more to the story that had been missing, or there are other aspects of things that were very connected, but they've been portrayed as being unconnected before, or just missed in some ways. A lot of historical work, I think, it's a bit like filling in the gaps, or kind of painting by numbers in some ways, in that there are these spaces where things haven't been done, and so you're trying to kind of work out what the detail there is, what kind of I don't know why I'm imagining a colouring in book, but what kind of like bit do you want to kind of colour into that space?
Yeah, what if there was a guiding hand, right? Like the question of the magical or the invisible hand that perhaps connected these in retrospect. That revisionism is somewhat unavoidable, and it gets taken to a little bit of flourish if you have kind of especially a greater dose of wine, perhaps.
Helps with writing sometimes. You have to. Well, here's the thing. So you need to be careful sometimes that the narrative that you've strung together when you're writing something, if it is imposed, to make clear that you've imposed it in a way. So there are certainly some chapters where I've connected things thematically, but I haven't said this thing led to this thing, led to this thing. And that's been a conscious choice, because I don't want to mislead by saying this is all connected in this kind of causal chain. But more, these are just things that are kind of that these things had in common with each other. Especially when you get to the chapters where the Great Exhibition has already happened and it's about the results of it, is that I noticed that there's certain trends in the society's history, or the kinds of activities that it pursues. And in trying to work out why, it kind of makes sense to look at, okay, what are the similar things that it was doing just before that, even though the people who were the organizers of those things may be slightly different.
I mean, it's an important question in the book. How much power can a central organization access on the outcome of certain trends in society? And what I found particularly interesting was how it's actually the big events that are needed, whether that's a climate or other natural phenomenon, or a big man-made event like the Great Exhibition, and then you need the institution to kind of create a concerted effort to act. So you have both the kind of the organizational part and the phenomenon that calls for the change to be affected. For example, how many things had to be changed or invented around the Great Exhibition, right? From the ventilation system to glass manufacturing to changing patent law, right? For goods. And that there was this guy, Henry Cole, who just like sat down and went through all of the steps, for example, needed to pass the patent. And then you realize like, oh my God, this is why patents are not being passed, but now we will have all these people exhibiting their products, and we will need to do this. So to me, that was very, very interesting. I don't know what would be like a contemporary, maybe the pandemic is actually an interesting example of a major need that requires concerted efforts, and how platforms that can organize that kind of effort have then the effect on the outcome of things. It's really, really interesting, and generally the Great Exhibition to me is I was so pleased that there was an entire, or actually 2 chapters basically dealing with that. One of the things that you said, and that kind of caught my ear, around there not necessarily being very specified goals around certain activities at the RSA today, which is a bit of a strange way of, I'm pretty sure this is the case, but if you actually look at how the RSA was created and how the whole idea was to incentivize innovation and invention through the premiums. So the whole thing simply based on his knowledge of human psychology that he learned in the North, that that you can kind of create a combination of self-interest and altruism that will, drive people to actually donate enough money for funds to be created, which then can be channeled toward the innovators. So it would be an interesting thing to probably to dig out what those incentives would be today.
That's interesting.
And if they have changed.
I mean, you do in some ways have aspects of the premium system in some of the society's activities now. So since the 1920s, you've got the Student Design Awards, which was originally focused on a particular problem of the early 20th century, which was this idea that you've got mass manufacturing on the one hand, and you've got designers being taught at art school, design school on the other hand, and they don't actually seem to be one employing the other, or the other even being interested in getting involved in mass manufacturing, trying to create this idea of there being such a thing as industrial design. And so connected with that, you've also got the Royal Designers for Industry, the Faculty of the Royal Designers for Industry, the kind of title that they inaugurate. And in some ways, that's similar to what the society was doing in the 18th century when it came to first cash prizes, like the SDAs, and also honorary medals in the same way that creating this new distinction for designers achieved. And now, more recently, both of those things have become much more about, well, I mean, as things change, the kind of priorities that change also as to how it is that they use those institutions. So the design is very much more focused on things like social impact, not just can you make a very pretty chocolate box or very nice textiles or something, but how can you as a designer also think about things like the environmental impact of those textiles, fast fashion, or what's the kind of waste implication for these sorts of things, and how can we kind of think about these kind of wider impacts of the kinds of designs that are taking place, as well as bringing in other forms of design, so user experience, the kind of service design aspects, as well as the physical aspects of things as well. So in some ways, you've still got some of that, and also they've got a program called the Catalyst Grants, which are to various basically cash for social enterprises from the fund, that is partly determined by some of the fellows today in terms of, so they have a big hand in deciding who gets what. So in some ways it's very similar, I think, to those things, with some differences, right? I mean, in the 18th century, you could have been a profit-making business or just an individual doing things for your own gain, but so long as you met the criteria, you could have got the prize. Today, I think, maybe because of the way we organize, we've got all these corporate structures, charity structures, and so on. The way that we've incorporated also kind of now has to be part of it. So, you have to be charitable giving. The society, having basically been an unincorporated association until 1847, is now a charity.
Sorry, we lost your audio, Anton. We lost just one sentence. Do you mind repeating? Sorry.
From where? What was the last thing I said? I said it basically it was until 1847 it was an unincorporated association. Now it's a charity. It's got a royal charter. It has all these other duties and obligations that come with the kind of structure that we nowadays very commonly use. And so I think there are just certain obligations and restrictions and particular ways that things have to be done to meet the kinds of categories that we now have. And I guess the Society of Arts is interesting because it doesn't really fit into most categories. It's maybe it is a social enterprise or something, or I don't know what the tax code would be in the US for these sorts of things, 501c3s or 4s or whatever. But because it's such an interesting organization in its own right, it doesn't really fit, I think, neatly.
So there was something wrong with my audio as well, but I think you can hear me now? Okay. So basically, it's very similar to how it was, and it still can be kind of hijacked by very powerful fellows. So if you have more charismatic people with their own agenda, we can just stop the recording if you don't want this to be on the record. Should we stop the recording?
No.
You want to do an off the record part? I'm quite curious.
I think it's harder now. I think it's harder to be Henry Cole, basically.
Okay.
Partly because
if I went there and I had enough land and Joseph, you're next, and I wanted to, and I would be able to kind of, convince enough people that we should just invest more in arts or I could technically do that.
I think you could get involved and you could make your case. I think the structures for making sure that the voices that individual members have get translated into reality are now filtered through lots of other things. So because the society, in some ways, the society, because it's no longer a direct democracy like it was in the first 100 years, and because the council, which used to be elected directly by the members, is now kind of at one remove from that because you've got a board of trustees because it's a charity, the kinds of avenues to take over the organization like you sometimes had in the past, that's now much, much harder. You'd have to really play a long game, I think, to try and achieve that. Maybe as an individual you could, but actually, weirdly, I think you'd have more success doing it as a member of staff in some ways, or as being a very, very, very active fellow and engaging with staff constantly. But I mean, one of the things there also is just the number of voices is much higher, right? The society has 30,000 fellows now, a lot of them with very different ideas about what it should be doing. And so there's a lot of kind of organization that goes into trying to work out what kinds of things to narrow the focus down on, given the kinds of things that lots of different people are pushing for. Whereas before, I think it was relatively easy just because there were it may have been lots of members, but few of them very actively involved. That said, I think it's still going to be somewhat responsive. Especially if you can persuade enough people and actually get the ball rolling on trying to move the organization in a particular direction.
But do you think that it being a charity, is it any way limiting? And I'm really, really happy to stop recording if, I'm just really curious about this. Is it being a charity limiting in how much the RSA is able to embrace maybe more disruptive ideas or things that don't fit with contemporary narratives of how, what would fit a Guardian headline? So if somebody comes in with less polite speech or more, maybe libertarian ideas, for example, would that be welcome? Because kind of the there are layers of kind of mainstream British communication that are very dominated by, you know, this left-wing Guardian vocabulary. And if you say anything that seems to kind of politically place you on the map, right? Even if you come from that group. So I'm wondering, just the charitable status, whether that puts that kind of stress on the organization. Because this used to be like
certain restrictions, definitely. Things like, I don't think that the sort of restrictions that maybe are that problem, that much of a problem if you wanted kind of real, you know, from left field kind of thinking, because it shouldn't be involved, I think, in terms of partisan politics. Never really has been. Certainly you've had a lot of politicians from all sorts of stripes involved, but I think it's always tried to chart a course where it doesn't side with any party, and I think it would be a big mistake historically for it to do so. Otherwise, maybe there's a limitation in terms of what it can do in terms of what it does with the money. You know, it can't necessarily funnel some of its funds into private enterprises in the same way that it did in the 18th and 19th centuries occasionally. So maybe there are kind of considerations there about what kinds of things it could do. As I said, the catalyst grants have to be given to, you know, to non-profit things, and that's, you know, maybe that's a good thing, but also maybe if it wanted to, there are kind of restrictions there about how it could do things. That said, it has been involved in setting up, you know, new structures like community banks just a few years ago, which in some ways are kind of private enterprises, and so, you know, although they're trying to envisage a new way in which those sorts of things can be organized, I think they were pretty good at getting around any kinds of restrictions in that regard. The main thing, I think, would be in terms of how it organizes itself, in terms of its structure, in terms of, you know, who actually calls the shots as to what it does and what it doesn't do. You know, it still has the kind of aspects of, you know, if you become a member, then you can go and vote at the AGM, like at a lot of other charities. But it's not the same as the 18th century, where you literally would, you know, one person, one vote, you'd hash it out every week on a Wednesday, and whatever the majority decided was what they did. I mean, I can't think of any corporate structure today that would possibly allow that kind of thing, right?
I mean, we mentioned Rome, and I don't, maybe this is where Joseph is going to also guide the conversation toward, but like, it's much easier to connect people into, you know, productive teams of collaborators when you're below the Dunbar number, right? When you have 30,000 members, you can create, you know, avenues of networking or subgroups where people can meet and find each other. But it's a much looser structure, I would imagine.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point. And I
More
think
like
that's one of the big challenges in terms of what it wants to do. Sorry?
So 30,000 people is more like an audience than a community.
Yeah, and I think that's that is one of the challenges, is you had all these fellows, tens of thousands, in the 20th century in particular. And actually, I think what the direction it's moving in is trying to treat those as a community rather than an audience, as people who could become actively involved. And I think that is, as you say, there are problems with how you do that and how you can get people to kind of buy in fully to that. I don't think they're insurmountable, though. You know, I think it's one of the, if there's an organization that can maybe go about and try and solve those sorts of issues, I'd be interested to see the RSA try. But I do think you need some kind of projects around which to organize this. And the RSA does have its projects right now. The interesting thing that you mentioned, which maybe I should pick up on, was this idea that you've got Guardian reading kind of consensus views. In some ways, the RSA has always had a bit of that, in that, you know, in the 18th century, the sorts of people who joined were very much the London elites. They were the only people who could afford to.
I remember Jonathan Haidt gave this talk 2 years ago. I was still living in London at the RSA. And they rip him apart, and he didn't even say anything. He wasn't even super right-wing yet. he was just like talking about, I don't know, Aristotle. And they just like go at him, and it was very interesting.
I mean, it could depend on the audience in the room. I mean, the sorts of, I actually have my experience of meeting fellows. I've not met even close to the 30,000, but my experience of meeting fellows is that they are from all sorts of backgrounds. They do tend to be people who in some ways are idealistic, though. And I don't know, those ideals are very different from one another. But some of them will be, Gardinistas. Some of them will be, I think, will have views that I couldn't even possibly imagine how to categorize them, because they're so bizarre and interesting and just kind of unexpected, I think.
I tried to pull the intellects at the beginning because it was anonymous, but I was wondering, like, what is the politics? What's happening in terms of politics in the community? And because we are kind of like thousands of people in and out of the interact right, with a kind of 300 to 500 people, massive kind of central core, and I think like 70% of the people said that they cannot be categorized by traditional party politics, and it was so interesting to me that that's a lot.
That sounds like the typical RSA fellow, to be honest. That they would actually actively say, no, I don't want you to categorize me. I don't want to be put into this box.
Yeah, and it would be interesting to see how, maybe the quality of the party politics layer is so terrible in the English-speaking world because the smart people no longer go into politics, right? Because they refuse those categories, and until there be new categories that the smart people can embrace, then the literati will be conglomerating in completely other arenas of society. But actually, Joseph, I think you've been so patiently waiting to ask your question. So if you want to take the floor.
Yeah, so this was a couple threads back, I think, when we are talking about...
We're way past the structure and the recording and all that, just like...
You're talking about how, no longer can you have one person who has an idea and then just kind of takes over the whole society, right? And do you think the fact that can't happen any longer, do you think that's a good thing or a bad thing? It doesn't really need to be either of those, of course, but.
Great question, Joseph.
Yeah. I think it, okay, I'm going to put my hands up and say this is my bias. I think it's maybe a bad thing. I think the RSA is good when it's kind of a tool for these kind of crazy ideas. That said, although it doesn't feel like it's happened that recently, it actually has in some ways. Some of the projects that it's done, certainly in the 90s, in the 80s, with the same structure, were basically just a single, a few individuals coming in with very precise ideas of what they wanted to do. And I think they were just so active and kind of, push these things through in the same way that some of these other people in the past, like Henry Cole and others, did. That maybe it just shows that, maybe we've just happened to have had a few people who prefer trying to get a consensus for their view, rather than some of these people who just decide that this is the way things are going to be done. So I think it's harder, but I don't think it's impossible. I think the recent history suggests that people like Prue Leith, for example, so you may recognize her from the Great British Bake Off as one of the judges. She was chairman of the RSA in the 90s. She's responsible for the 4th plinth on Trafalgar Square, always having contemporary works of art rather than just a kind of another old statue of a general or a king. And that was one of the things that she basically just decided the RSA should get involved with, and kind of persuaded some of the people in charge to do that. So I think so long as the people in charge are relatively open, which I think they tend to be, I think the kind of job sort of, even if there've been a few chairmen or directors or CEOs or whatever the title is who are slightly less open, they don't tend to last as long as the ones who do actually kind of get new directions that the RSA could go in. I mean, the other thing about people like Henry Cole in the 19th century, though, is I think the big reason for his success is that he could do stuff that today would basically be illegal, like, you know, having massive conflicts of interest and facing absolutely no consequences for them, or it even being pointed out as being a problem for him at all. You know, he's a civil servant at the same time as being, you know, very influential in the Society of Arts and vice president or president of various other societies that he also gets involved in. You know, he's a man with many hats. I think it's very difficult now for people to have lots of hats at the same time and, you know, use them in a way that very clearly is a conflict of interest between those different things.
The Elon Musks can do it. So if you have the FU money, right, today, but it has to be
have sufficient cash. I mean, that's the interesting thing about Cole is he's not even that rich himself personally, right? He's just a civil servant.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Like today, you have to be able to buy entire countries if you want to misbehave so publicly.
Yeah. I mean, the big thing though is really, you know, even if the structure of the society looks like it is stacked against you, I think, you know, a lot of the time you can just, it's the people who have a go who get it done. And even if it seems like things are dominated or by a kind of stasis, I think it's possible to cut through those things. That seems to be one of the lessons time and again, is that ultimately the RSA in some ways is like a tool waiting to be picked up until the right person comes along and decides that they can, and they just do.
I mean, this kind of reminds me of a couple of very interesting debates around how the nature of innovation is changing, right? So we used to have the lonely genius ideal sitting under the tree, the apple falls on his or her head, and then this one person kind of retreats into a dark room, and 6 months later with a beard emerges and says like, Eureka, I now know, and whereas, you know, Michael Nielsen and a couple of other theorists will argue that today groups invent and groups should win the Nobel Prize, and it's always a lab, it's always in some ways, you know, networked intelligence, and this, you know, comes up in the chapter about when the managers take over and the decisions by committees, and how, you know, the individual agent being replaced by a group can change how incentives are executed or acted upon. And actually, one of my questions around this would be similar to what Julie asked at the beginning, how you changed writing that book. My question would be, was there something about innovation, which is your field, that you changed your mind about while writing this book? Where you were like, oh, this is how this works. Holy shit. Okay. I'm going to write about this on my Substack. I'm going to kind of ping and poke the current practitioners to say, hey, in 1825, this guy did this. And that worked. We should do it again.
That's an interesting question. I think yes. In some ways, I think I'd underestimated before just how involved a lot of inventors in a kind of technical field were also involved in what you might call institution building or social reform. I'd already sort of had that bias, not bias, but that kind of hunch, I think, before. But in the process of researching it, not even necessarily the stuff that ended up in the book itself, but noticing lots of different cases in which that happened, it became clear to me that, you know, very often they're doing these things with a kind of public spirited kind of thing in mind, which is why, you know, I dedicate the book to the public spirited, a little bit cheesy, but it felt right in terms of what the RSA actually is and does, and kind of I wanted to kind of act as a sort of roadmap in some ways, or guidebook to how it's been done.
I loved it so much. I even edited it into the description for this event.
Oh, did you?
I opened the book and I was like, oh, it's for me.
But I think that's, I mean,
have you guys seen that? I think I even tweeted. I photographed.
I saw you tweet it. Yeah, I'm glad you noticed.
I am cheesy. Maybe like these things just work on me. There was this Umberto Eco quote in a browser newsletter recently, which says like, 2 cliches make you laugh, but 1,000 cliches deeply move you. And I thought, yeah, because that's That's our life. Our life is 1,000 cliches, and then you die. So of course it will move you, and you will be like, "That's me." So it's absolutely fantastic. Any other questions from the floor? I can before I completely usurp it. Yeah, go, Julie. And
Yeah.
Yoda to your cat. I love that you named your cat.
My cat Yoda I love it when he
so
visits. So I am from the United States. I'm in Seattle, and I've heard of the RSA, but not a whole lot. And I realized my exposure, I don't know how exactly it happened, but is through those great cartoon drawing histories that unfold. Like that's I know nothing else about it, and I haven't read your book, but I just have always thought that was such an immensely creative, engaging way to learn things, and they're so well done, and the drawing unfolds, but there's also some writing, and I just wanted to share that, and just like if you have anything you want to say specifically about that, or I mean, to me and I don't know how widely known they are or how used they are, but another element that's really interesting to me about your idea, the organization of snobs, whatever Marx's daughter said about, like that it was all these
Society of snobs.
Yeah, elites. But it seems like that form of graphics is, like I don't want to put my foot in my mouth too much, but like going from, trying to reach out to more people through using that form, and more of the common woman and man, or so I'm just curious, anything you might want to say about that?
Sure. I mean,
Can I just add a note here? Because, we always talk about how vicious the tabloid culture in the UK today is. But if you actually look at like 18th century and 19th century articles and caricatures and the satirical plays about the people in the industry or aristocrats, it was pretty harsh.
Yeah. I mean, so I actually worked with the artist, Andrew Park, who invented RSA Animates. So this idea of whiteboard animation. So, I mean, they are very well known. They've had millions of views within a very short space of time. They continue to do them. They now have occasional short ones where he still does some of them. They have other artists who occasionally do kind of slightly alternative styles. So actually, if you're ever in London, it's well worth going and visiting the RSA, I guess, when we're permitted to. But when it's possible, there is an 11-meter mural by Andrew, and which I kind of helped him do, because while I was writing the book, he was doing this huge mural in that same kind of cartoony style of the Society's history down in the coffee house. And so you can actually kind of you can follow a lot of the book. And actually what's funny about it from my perspective, and actually from both our perspective, was that because it was happening while I was writing the book, and because I wrote so much of the book just in the final few months, we'd already finished the mural by the time I was just starting writing certain chapters. And so you have, there's like 3 big panels, 2 very long ones and 1 kind of shorter one. So the first massive panel was basically all the stuff I'd already researched, which was the 18th century, the origins, 18th century through to the 19th. And the kind of second panel actually deals with a lot of that stuff as well. And then we kind of were like, oh crap, we need to like fit all this other stuff that I know I need to write about at some point into the kind of final bit of the second panel and the third panel. And that was a really fun experience, because it was fun to see just a few, sometimes I'd have a little suggestion. I think, wouldn't it be funny if we just kind of put, this is one I can definitely say was one of my things I suggested, was there's a boat. It shows the lifeboat, which is one of the things that that this RSA gave the premium for. And it's got a bunch of inventors in the lifeboat who are also doing stuff to do with saving lives at sea. So those sorts of prizes they were doing in the 18th, early 19th century. So you've got a guy with his semaphore, because they gave a prize for semaphore. You've got the lifeboat, you've got various other things. And then the bit I suggested was that there were two inventors, each of whom at different times, one of them got a prize for a mortar that would send a line from the ship to the shore to save sailors from shipwrecks. So, you'd have this little cannon and you kind of fire this grapple hook to the shore. But there was also another inventor who got this a pretty similar prize a few years, either before or after, I can't remember, for the opposite, for a mortar that would fire from the shore to the ship. And so we've got these inventors all in this boat together, and someone from the shore is firing one and the other one's firing one from the ship, and they're kind of all ducking as these two things go past each other. So yeah, it was a lot of fun. And actually, so there was a very brief kind of trailer bit, which is sort of an animated version of the cover, which Andrew did for me when we launched the book. There's a kind of very short animated version of it growing out and so on. And we're also hoping to do a sort of short, I guess, trailer of a documentary of the RSA's history together, where it'd be kind of the animation as well. So that's one of the projects that are sort of in the works for us, because it's a lot of fun working with an artist. I say this all the time, so this is not something you need to cut from the recording, because I actually say it in events with him, and he's well aware of this. But when we started working together, I was a bit suspicious. I was like, artist coming in, he's gonna take his artistic license with the history and start doing all sorts of things and drawing things that didn't happen and that kind of thing. And actually, he was the exact opposite. He was such a stickler for detail. He would ask me for, if he wanted to show something, he would ask for the picture so he could actually base his drawings off stuff every time. Wanted to make sure every character was actually based on a real character as far as he could. So much so that he's, pestering me for all these things while I'm trying to write the book. So we ended up with a kind of opposite dynamic where I expected him to be going off like, when you have the suspicion that the movie won't be as good as the book and they'll take all these artistic liberties, I felt like it might end up like that. It was the exact opposite, that he was so faithful to the history that we ended up working quite a lot more than we'd expected together.
I love this so much. I mean, actually, we have 10 or so minutes left, and you mentioned a little bit, where you see the RSA's future going. Do you think that the institution is just before a new renaissance? And if so, what do you think that will be about? Are there dominant groups within society that you think will, gain more of a platform, or do you see any trends in society that you think the RSA will have to respond to in some ways? You mentioned the climate crisis, obviously, and sadly David has had to log off at 11, so he's one of our climate experts, but we can later on update him.
It's a good question. I think we're on the cusp of something potentially, and I think that's partly structural. So the society's been becoming a lot less formal. So actually something Julie alluded to in her last question as well, about reaching out to a broader demographic than it had done traditionally. And I think that's a good thing. And I think that's actually kind of in some ways more in keeping with the origins, where although it was the elites, in some way they were shrinking the gap between the aristocracy and the middle classes, in much the same way that coffee houses had done. And I think that's something then in the 19th century, trying to also get more working people involved from more ordinary backgrounds and so on. So I think there's a good trend there. And I think, personally, so there's a few things. One of them is that they adopted royal, they adopted fellow, they created this perception that society is some kind of fellowship, stuffy organization where it's an honor to become elected a fellow, when actually it's just, you're just a member who subscribed to the fund and subscribed to the vision and, want to get involved. And that's always what it has been. It's never been a kind of fellowship organization like become, if you're a famous scientist, you might become a fellow of the Royal Society. Society of Arts has nothing to do with that. Having letters FRSA is just a signal that you are a subscriber to the mission and to the fund. So I think in that way, it's
advertise it in very relatively aggressive ways. Like I participated in a couple of like roundtables and stuff like that, where they invited me as an expert. And afterwards, I was on this mailing list, and I was very kind of heavily pressured to start paying. And
I mean, they want to gain fellows, right, and get people involved.
Yeah.
I mean, you're exactly the sort of person, I'm
but
sure,
they
want to get involved as a fellow, right? So
no, but what I mean is, like, I didn't have to go and bang on the door and prove myself and get accepted.
Right.
It's
yes.
more like
so it's not an exclusive organization, and really, it's not supposed to be either, right? In fact, from the very beginning, it's had women as members because William Shipley, the founder, said, "Well, I don't see why we wouldn't want to get women not involved. Like, why wouldn't I want their money if they're public spirited people and we can use their money for the fund and they can have their say in how it gets done? Why shouldn't they? This is a kind of basic thing for him." He says, "I see no reason that they would be behindhand in their kind of their love of the public good, their patriotism at the time being kind of public spiritedness, rather than kind of with the nationalistic overtones." I've forgotten what question I was answering. I'm sorry.
The next renaissance of.
Oh, right, yeah. So they adopted all this royal and fellow stuff, and at the same time, they was persisting with having examinations, which they started charging for in the 1880s, and they kept on having examinations right up until 1980s. And what that did was, it kind of, basically by the late 1980s, the Society of Arts was essentially an examinations board with this kind of weird thing attached to it, which is what I would call the RSA itself. And that thing was much smaller than the examinations board. So when they finally decided, I think very bravely and rightly, by the way, to get rid of the examinations board, kind of push it out, let it be its own thing, and actually exists today, it merged with the Oxford and Cambridge ones to become OCR, which is still an exam board. I took exams, I think, that were OCR exams when I was at school. It lost 3/4 of its staff, 3/4 of its revenue, its entire operating surplus. I mean, that really forced it financially to start doing some soul searching and try to work out what it is that it wants to do. And so you then start to get some interesting projects again, I think. It had had a few before, but it was allowed to be complacent in the intervening years where you didn't have some of the big things that were going on. Again, that's not to do down some of the, I think, very impressive things that it was doing, despite the fact that it had this kind of, the possibilities of being complacent. I'm not saying it always was complacent, it's just it was allowed to be at certain other points. Whereas before that, I think membership always fluctuated with the activity of the society. Great exhibition, membership shoots up. Not great exhibition in the years afterwards, without as many activities, it starts to decline a bit. In the 18th century, when it's doing loads of stuff, it goes up. When it's not doing as much, it declines a bit. I mean, that's healthy, I think. And since basically they chose royal and the use of fellow, membership has basically just gone up, regardless of its activities. So personally, I think, the real, you'd be coming full cycle if it dropped the royal. That's something that I'm always quite vocal about it to staff whenever I meet fellows and so on. I don't think they'll quite do it. I guess saying RSA instead of Royal Society of Think of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce, kind of downplaying the royal a bit, has been something that recently the society have been doing a lot more. In some ways, I think that's a good thing. But I think to really do it properly, you need to kind of bite the bullet and actually just get rid of that whole association. Keep the Royal Charter, but because that's more to do with how it's incorporated. But the use of royal was always an optional thing, and they've chosen to use it since 1908. And I don't think they have to.
This is interesting. And Troy, I'm going to pass the mic on to you in 1 second. Just, there's a very interesting, or a couple of interesting passages in the book about and not just on the propaganda level, but deeply embedded in the spirit of the activities of the original early RSA, this interesting combination of the international sentiments, the globally extended altruism, where you want to benefit all of mankind. I think it's also in the Great Exhibition chapters, and the patriotism, and this interesting thing where depending on who you have to raise money from or who do you have to sell something to, you can kind of emphasize one or the other. Do you think that this international sentiment or ethos is still there in the activities of the RSA?
I would say more so internationalist than before. Certainly in terms of the vision that they have for the fellowship being much more international. They've really been pushing to try and have a kind of US basis where the US fellows organize themselves as a separate entity in some ways, but with the same umbrella kind of ethos, if you like. They've been doing the same in various other countries as well. So I think, definitely Matthew Taylor, the current chief exec, he wants it to be not just a national improvement agency, but an international improvement agency. As to how he goes about that, or the kinds of projects they choose, I think that's still in the works. But this is why I feel like it's kind of structurally, it's getting closer to being the kind of organization that I think can do what it wants to do. And I think, certainly having talked to him for the book, a lot of he saw his tasks certainly in the recent past as being trying to craft this to be a usable tool, kind of administrative reforms, which sound a bit boring, but actually are everything when it comes to being able to pick up that tool and then use it to a particular end.
And maybe your book will be instrumental in achieving that. If it's published in the US, people, it gets into the right hands, at the right institutions or, academic faculties.
I hope so. I hope it inspires people to kind of, they don't have to do another great exhibition, although actually that's not a bad idea. But I hope it kind of shows mistakes, it shows successes, and it shows the kinds of attitudes that result in those successes. That kind of can do, get your hands dirty kind of attitude that maybe gets more people involved.
And I think you really did a wonderful job at laying out the narrative elements in how people had there was this trend where people decided that, okay, so if we have a stronger professional class or productive class and people want to educate themselves, then why shouldn't the RSA pay and send lecturers to these evening schools, etc., and kind of both the self-interest and the idealism I'm working together with what was happening in society in general. I love that. Troy, are you still with us? Do you want to do an audio question?
Yes, I'm with you. I want to say thank you, Anna and Anton, for an excellent talk. I'm a practitioner. I do a lot of strategy consulting work with startups and early stage innovation companies. I'm in a second tier market for that, which is Atlanta, Georgia. Probably one of the leading markets outside of New York and San Francisco, but also sort of definitely second place. And I've got an academic background, but again, like I say, like most of my work is practitioner focused. I've been looking a lot at startup and entrepreneurial communities of practice and so-called innovation centers. Atlanta's corporations went big into innovation centers for a while. They've been a pretty much universal failure for various reasons. It's a disaster, but we call it innovation theater. But one thing I've been getting more interested in is the idea of social currency being the primary economic reward for successful communities. And that's what we're seeing in Silicon Valley, because basically the short answer is we have too much money in the US. And so there are a lot of companies getting funded that may never be profitable, no matter how many billions you throw at them and so on. But they get investments because they're rewarding a social capital system in the Valley. And it's incredibly powerful. I've been reading a guy called Alex Danko, who's following this. Again, another practitioner publishes informally, like discovered him through Twitter, has a neat newsletter and so forth. And also, of course, Barabasi and his social network work, and he is more academic. And I'm getting increasingly convinced that it is a lone solitary genius in a dark garret room who also somehow has a million friends all over. So when he emerges, that's when, I mean, you know, Basquiat being an example Barabasi cites, he was part of a two-man collective.
We've just done a bunch of events about seniors. We were talking about
absolutely. Absolutely.
There's research to support this. The more international friends you have, it doesn't matter what talent you have. I mean, you should be talented, but like there are a lot of talented people.
Right. And ultimately, you know,
who are not popular, because it's the popular people who make it in art, in science.
And talent is written by the victor, right? I mean, Basquiat is talented, but is he as talented as other members of the New York scene? And then
Julian,
you know, you can make an argument. Yeah. Well, maybe not Julian Schnabel, but.
Well, he was the person to decide whether he was talented in 1988 when Basquiat was
right.
dead.
Which was a very clever move on his part. I'm joshing here, but
he also wanted to have the recognition of having discovered somebody that nobody else recognizes talent.
Right. Right. And so I mean, smarter people than me have written this book, but what I'm saying is this might be interested to think about in terms of future directions for the RSA. Is there enough social reward? And no, it's not like, oh, I'm a royal fellow or whatever. It would have to be different, right? But I'd also find a restaurant. Ideally, not a very good restaurant, but make sure everybody goes there. There's this diner in Silicon Valley, which is responsible for like 20 of the past billionaire startups in the world. They'll go for breakfast there.
Well, I think
it's a terrible
RSA
diner.
Hopes that the coffee house that they opened in their basement, which is very good, by the way. I said, by saying it's in the basement, I made it sound very dingy and dark, when actually it's not at all. It's quite a buzz with conversation and plans, usually, I guess, pre-COVID.
Could they make it dingier and darker? Because that might be, you know, I mean, that's often the thing, right? I mean, it's never
secluded enough spaces actually that you can do some plotting.
That's good.
Yeah, I think there's definitely rooms that are appropriate, because it's actually both the library and the coffee house at the same time.
Right.
So it kind of has the more library spaces, which is actually technically still the coffee house.
It's like Frank Musso's in Hollywood. It may be the worst food on the West Coast. You could make an excellent argument, but everybody in Hollywood goes there still, you know, 70, 80 years after it was opened.
Well, what are you talking about in Silicon Valley? Alice's?
What's the it's that sort of I'm totally spacing the name now. It's that place
where all the startup deals got struck. Phil's Coffee, no? And their scone is terrible.
Well, there's a place like a little bit out of town where they all go for breakfast, and it looks like really rustic, right?
I think it's Alice's is probably what you're talking about.
Okay.
There are two of them that are like off a skyline, but.
Well, it's also an interesting question whether these places will become, you know, digital due to COVID, due to people moving back to second, third tier cities or even smaller places. You know, and if so, what will be the exclusive kind of dark corners on the internet where you can plot the equivalents of shitty diners with terrible breakfast and, you know, oily folks, where nevertheless the best companies, the best ideas, the best collaborations are born. I think that's a very, very interesting. I think I will talk to the people running the Cineas events, because this could actually be a very interesting topic to explore at one of our salons, the physical spaces where this kind of conspiracy happens. I'm actually doing a secret society salon on the 30th. So
oh, nice.
If you want to come, it's going to be a special thing.
I couldn't decipher the details from it. I was looking at them. I was like, I don't know how to decipher this.
Yeah. Okay. So there's the password hidden in the cover photo, and that's going to be the Zoom. That's going to be this. That's why some of you couldn't come in on time, because we were playing around to make it possible, to make sure that it can be done, and my Zoom settings got set to that. I changed now. So basically, you find out what the code word is from the cover photo of the event, on 30th of September. It's on our website, interinsight.com. And then you come to the event, and when I send you the Zoom invite, you type in this word, and then you can come into the event. And so when I will open it, all of you who are there will be people who have figured it out. It's very simple, by the way, so don't overthink it.
Oh, is it? Okay.
And we will be talking about secret societies and what it is in humans. Like, you have these two instincts. One is you want to be accepted and everybody to love you. And on the other hand, like, you put 5 people in the room, there will be 2 clicks immediately.
Yeah.
Like, you want to be different, right? So that will be interesting. But we're kind of running out of time. And thank you so much, Anton, for still sitting with us. Do you mind just kind of like a closing coda thing for this discussion, to talk a little bit about your upcoming book without any pressure? Like, if this is a psychologically dangerous territory to discuss now.
Oh, for the next book?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can talk about that one. Basically, so this is weirdly, I think it's one of the things I'm maybe better known for this than I am for this first book that came out, because it's the thing I've been working on for much, much longer, which is this very large data set that I compiled of a bit under 2,000 inventors of the Industrial Revolution. And so starting in the 16th century, going through to the mid-19th century, I chose the Great Exhibition as a sort of symbolic end to the period, looking at what it is that drove those inventors, what it is that actually caused them to invent in the first place. Why did they choose to become inventors? And so the main theory that I have there is that you have this mentality, what I call the improving mentality, that seems to spread from person to person. And I found evidence that for the vast majority of the people in that sample, I could find that they knew another inventor before they themselves became an inventor. So kind of spreading on this habit from person to person. And then kind of that's the sort of core of the book in some ways, but the other core, or the kind of other bit that I've really been working on, is looking at the public spirited institutions that they were creating. So what kind of ways were they creating through organizing amongst themselves to spread innovation further? So how were they taking this spreading, improving mentality and then kind of spreading it more efficiently and spreading it further afield and wider and so on? And so you can trace nearly all of the kind of invention affecting institutions, informal ones, formal ones, norms and so on, I think, back to, again, groups of inventors who are organizing these things and coming up with visions of how it should work. I mean, we've mentioned the Society of Arts, that's one of them, the Royal Society before that, and, patent reform, came out of the Society of Arts, and as well as inventors who are involved with it and so on. So it kind of, that's the main thrust of that book.
Well, I can't wait to read it. And you will be going back to your PhD, right?
Yeah, in some ways. I mean, I keep saying it's my PhD, and it's now completely different in so many ways. I guess the bare bones of it is the same. The skeleton's the same.
This is fantastic. Do you think that this is going to be your field of expertise throughout your career, or is this just the entry and you will be just diving into some completely different topic for every book?
I'll probably write a third one on invention. In fact, I've pretty much already agreed to write a third one on invention, though I'm still working through the details of that one. At some point, I'd like to branch out into a few other things. This is a very random one, but for a while, for some reason, I've become slightly obsessed, actually in writing Arts and Minds, with the 7 Years' War, which very few people have heard of. But Americans will know it as the I think the American-Indian War. I think it's the French and American War. And in India, it'll be known as the Third Carnatic War. Basically, it's the First World War, or the First Global War. That's actually the title of the book I'll write. The First Global War, because it takes place on multiple continents. I think it's the first to do so. It's basically Britain's struggle with a lot of other countries for dominance of the oceans, and that's where it finally comes out on top, basically, after having struggled over it for quite a few decades. And it's, again, one that people know very little about. I think there's so many different theatres there, that I think it'd be a great narrative to tell and kind of draw it together as the book on that war. I've gone into bookshops and looked for books on it, and I'll find, if I go into the huge Waterstones, this is kind of, I guess, the UK equivalent of Barnes and Noble. If I go into the huge central Waterstones in London, I'll find an entire room on World War II. I'll find maybe another room on all history since World War II. I'll find a section, like a whole shelf, good big hefty shelf from World War I, and then a single shelf on all other wars before World War I. Maybe like a big chunk of that for Napoleon. And then for some reason, the 7 Years' War, despite being such a huge and important war, it's just, just barely there. So I think there's potential there.
And then for your fourth book, I'm really waiting for somebody to write the comprehensive history of the House of Thurn und Taxis, because it is so good. When I was a screenwriter, I wanted to create a Netflix series because it's amazing. It's one of the best things ever.
What's this? Sorry.
Thurn und Taxis. There was this. It's still a house of aristocrats in Germany. They started in like the late 13th century in Corneo in Italy. Amadeo Tasso, this guy, takes 32 of his cousins to create the first postal service. It's just 32 Italian dudes with their horses. And by like 1491, it took the same amount of time to take a letter from Vienna to Brussels. It took less time than today. It was 5 days. Today, if I send a letter from Vienna to here, it will take 7 days at least. And it's amazing. And they enabled all these correspondences between all the composers and the physicists and like Einstein and everything. And they were kind of in it. They were very, that's why we have their symbol was the horn, right? That's why you have the horn as a symbol of the post. Right. The name taxi comes from that because they were the postal coaches were the Thurn und Taxis coaches. And it's just the whole thing is like, like how you have these Forrest Gump stories, like there's like something in the background, and it was not a secret society, like they were like related by blood. This is a family, or is a family, they still exist, and it's like kind of Paris Hilton kind of people today, like reality show stars. But they were always there. Whatever, all the cool things that happened in like Mitteleuropa since the 1300s, there was always the Thurn und Taxis somehow involved.
That's great.
And I think that's like so cool. It's like we watch Game of Thrones. This is
How is there already a book on this? There surely is a book on this.
You would think there was a book on the RSA or the
That's true.
I think people don't really like to dig through data too much. Probably it's like book written about books rather than books written about actual things, no?
That's true. That's true.
So just like look into the Thurn und Taxis. That's what I'm saying.
I'll add it to the
list. Something there that's actually very strongly corresponding to your field of interest. Or maybe someone else here will be faster than you. Maybe Troy. Thank you so much, guys. I don't know how much of this will be useful as a recording. We went into very informal tangents, but this has been so much fun. And Anton, all of my congratulations. This book is absolutely crazy. I will be responsible for at least like 7 people buying it.
Great.
So.
Thanks very much.
And I completely agree with your kind of Gardner cycle here, that there will be like some sales now, but it will be a book that will always be there, and there will always be students and people interested in this, and it will have, I think, a long history of readership. Maybe one that will outlive you. So it's definitely a success for an author.
Cool. Well, thanks very much. Thanks for having me on as well.
Thank you, guys. Take good care.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.